Okay, so we are definitely recording. So let's look at these regions of the brain. So if you look at the top of the brain, you have the cerebral hemispheres, and they are lateralized, meaning that there are functions in the different left and the right that are uh, specific to a location within the cerebral hemispheres. So this just shows you the cerebral hemispheres or the cerebrum, and the cerebellum is below these structures. So notice that most of the brain is the cerebral hemispheres. The central sulcus, a sulcus is a little valley, a gyrus is a ridge. So all of this is higher level cerebral tissue that is arranged in a very compact fashion in order to establish a lot of brain tissue in the cerebral hemispheres. So what does this uh, part of the brain do? So the occipital lobe controls vision, the temporal lobe auditory function, the frontal lobe is uh, higher thought, executive function, going through complex activities, uh, and this central sulcus uh, has in front of it a precentral gyrus, and that's where muscle activity is coordinated behind the central sulcus, right here and right here. The postcentral gyrus is where the immediate control of sensory input and information is going to come from all the rest of the central nervous system uh, for processing sensory information, and that's going to be uh, depending on what the processing states. You're going to have muscle activity from nerve cells within the precentral gyrus. We take a cross section of the brain, uh, the frontal lobe. So here's the central sulcus. Here's the precentral gyrus, the postcentral gyrus. The corpus callosum is the white matter that connects the two cerebral hemispheres. The diencephalon is the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The pineal gland is part of that. So the pineal gland is right here. So that's the diencephalon. Uh, then we have the optic chiasma, where the nerves from the eyes cross on their way back to the visual cortex. Is that somebody trying to get in? Nope. Okay. So then we have the uh, midbrain. Then the brain, that's all made up of brain stem, contains the midbrain right here, and the pons and the medulla oblongata are uh, contain the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. We'll talk about the functions of these structures. So we have the cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon. So here's the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and part of the pineal gland, that's the diencephalon. Here's the cerebellum, which is involved in coordination of learned movement, like riding a bike or typing or swimming and so on, playing tennis. So that's been involved in storing patterns of memory so that once you learn to ride a bike, you got it. So make sure to know these structures. All of these will end up, I'm not going to ask about parietal occipital sulcus. but all of these other structures could be in questions. So there are 4 hollow chambers in the brain filled with cerebral spinal fluid. The choroid plexus is special structures that have a large blood supply that are going to produce cerebral spinal fluid, which circulates through the ventricles or cavities of the brain and circulate through the subarachnoid space. And then information and products and structures are going to be shared with the blood system. So the ventricles of the brain, if you look at the sagittal view and a superior view, you can see that the lateral ventricles, then you have a third ventricle, then you have this mesencephalic aqueduct, and you have the fourth ventricle, which is on its way to the spinal cord. So the cerebral spinal fluid is generated within all of these vesicles of the brain, or the ventricles, and that solution is going to be exchanging substances and materials with the blood and going to be circulated around the brain in this subarachnoid space. So in the choroid plexuses is where the cerebral spinal fluid is produced, and you have the fluid being moved down from the third ventricle, from the lateral ventricles into the choroid plexus, fourth ventricle, and that fluid is going to be circulated in the spinal cord, around the spinal cord, and it's going to be circulated in the subarachnoid space, and you can see the movement there, and that information or that fluid is constantly circulating around the subarachnoid space. The cerebral spinal fluid is made by these choroid plexuses, and the circulation of fluid is going to go around the spinal cord, and then it's also going to come from these ventricles, and it's going to circulate around the entire brain. Okay, so here's the cerebral cortex. That's the brain, and here's the pia mater and so on. And here we have the sinus where the cerebral spinal fluid is going to be circulating. Okay, what are the functions of the cerebral hemispheres? Thought, intellectual activity, memory, complex patterns of movement. So we said that gyri are the ridges, the depressions are the sulci, the fissures are dividing boundaries in the cerebral hemispheres. We'll have a longitudinal fissure and so on, and we'll have a central sulcus that we mentioned. We mentioned these structures. We'll talk about them in a moment again. So the primary motor cortex directs voluntary movement. The primary sensory cortex receives information on touch, pain, pressure, temperature. And there are association areas in the brain. There are association areas in the spinal cord. So if we look at a picture of the brain, we have all the areas of the cerebral hemispheres, the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. So here's the central sulcus, and the primary motor cortex takes care of muscle movement. All sensory information is processed in this primary sensory cortex called the postcentral gyrus. There's association areas that are involved in the processing of that sensory information, and so on. Here we have the somatic motor association area. So all these parts of the brain are working together. So the primary motor cortex and the sensory motor association, somatic motor association, all these parts of the brains are working together to coordinate muscle movement. These parts are involved in processing sensory input, which leads to uh, muscle activity. Taste is controlled in the gustatory cortex. The olfactory cortex is here, just above the temporal lobe. Visual cortex as an auditory association area too. So the functions of the cerebral hemisphere are based upon location with uh, frontal lobe to occipital lobe to parietal lobe to temporal lobe. I mentioned hemispheric lateralization. So we have the left side, the left hemisphere taking control of interpretation of events and speech centers, language-based skills, and the uh, representational hemisphere, the right, spatial relationships and logical analysis. So lateralization means that different functions are associated with left or right parts of the brain. So if we look at the right hand here, notice that that right hand is processed in the left side, and the left hand here is processed in the right side. So notice we have mathematical calculation, language on the left side. If we have spatial visualization, so location is very important in the brain, and uh, it's lateralized, meaning that some things happen in the right hemisphere, other things happen in the left hemisphere. Okay, let's go ahead and stop there.